Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. You know, lots of us are wondering what's happening with our oil and gas business, our energy business, Alberta, et cetera. And so I read an interesting column in the Financial Post recently, written by a gentleman by the name of Peter Tertzakian, who's the Deputy Director of ARC Energy Research Institute, and he's the founder of Energy File, and an author, podcaster, and public speaker. He's got a far better microphone, as you'll see in a minute, than I do. I wanted to check in with them and find out, what's going on in the energy sector. And I think we're going to talk about a couple of different issues. We're going to talk about the impact of Alberta's energy sector because of COVID-19, because of new and rising oil prices, because they've been low historically, but they now look like they're going up. Ottawa's emissions goal, rising Canadian dollar and the impact on exports and investments, inflation, and what's going to happen after the pandemic. So, Mr. Tertzakian, thank you so much for joining us. How are you, sir?
Very well, thanks. My pleasure.
So maybe just to start off with, tell us a little bit about what ARC is, if you could.
Sure. ARC Financial's been around for over 3 decades. We're investors in Canada's energy sector, invested in all sorts of energy disciplines, from oil, gas, renewables, clean tech, broad spectrum. Being located in Calgary, obviously we have significant exposure to oil and gas.
Yep.
But because we've been in business for 30 decades, we're now shifting more to the whole clean tech space.
And investing in energy companies, or in commodities, or in the wells, or what?
Companies.
So investing in stocks, equities.
Private,
not public.
Private, not public.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
And what's your background? You have been involved, I understand, for over 30 years in the energy sector.
Yeah. I started out working in the field in oil and gas exploration, in the very technical side of the business, then moved into the office and developed software algorithms for figuring out how to map where the oil and gas is. So very technical. But I left the business in 1990 and went into the technology space back when the internet was emerging and biotech was just emerging. It was a very fascinating period and was actually exposed to the financial world. So I finally made the switch back then into the financial industry, services industry, as an analyst, covering technology. But of course, being located where I am in Calgary, couldn't help but come back to the world of energy, not only oil and gas, but even the alternative energy, as it was called back in the late 1990s. And so a broad spectrum of financial, technical expertise, have a real bent for understanding how society evolves its sources and uses of energy. And it's been a very exciting time, but none as exciting as it is now.
And why is that? Because of COVID, or because of rising oil prices? Why?
No, rising oil prices we've seen many times before, and falling as well. COVID, certainly haven't seen in my lifetime, but that's just another, I would call, external factor that is serving as a disruptor of the whole live, work, and play paradigm, which ultimately affects energy. But it's a time like no other, because also for the first time in certainly a century and a half since the migration to oil and gas, that we are seeing viable alternatives to that whole paradigm.
Really? So alternative energy, you must be one of the only people in the oil patch that's interested in things other than oil.
I would not say that's true. That may have been true half a dozen years ago up to, but no, there's a lot of people now that are actually shifting strategies and mindsets and things in and around the oil patch. Alberta and is a very entrepreneurial place. It's got the benefit of having pretty much every natural resource you can imagine, from forestry, agriculture, oil, gas, wind, sun. And so if you look at the history of our province, we have a tendency to migrate to where the opportunities are. Sometimes we're a little more resistant, as is human nature. But I would say certainly in the last couple of years, and in fact, in many ways, catalyzed by the pandemic and other factors, including the climate change imperative, we are seeing big structural shifts again in our economy here.
So what do you think the big opportunities are then?
Well, the opportunities are to diversify into decarbonized sources of energy. The opportunities are to decarbonize the legacy energy systems that we have. Talking for a minute about oil and gas, I mean, we've spent the last 120 years here extracting oil and gas. We'll continue to do so, but in far different ways, far more efficiently. But we now have a price on carbon that's going to accelerate. We are seeing carbon markets establish. Carbon becomes a commodity. And we have expertise, the industry does, in understanding not only how to extract it, chemically engineer it into other products. So taking carbon out of streams, whether it comes from cement plants, steel plants, the atmosphere, wherever, and putting it back in the ground is just a natural extension of what we can do. So that's, what's happening in the oil and gas industry is it is the business of carbon. It always has been, but now that business of carbon is being changed and we are adapting to it. But beyond that, I mean, as I said, we've got deregulated electricity markets. We've got a renewable energy rush happening here in terms of some of the biggest solar farms that are being built. We have plenty of wind, I can tell you firsthand. And so, it's, as I said, we are one of the very few jurisdictions in the world, I would say Canada as a whole, where we have the privilege of virtually every natural resource you can imagine. And therefore, as imperatives change, economies change, priorities change, we can adapt to it.
This is interesting because I guess I was myopic in thinking that Alberta wasn't seeing this kind of a future of alternative energy and was trying to live in the past. And so it's very encouraging to me, your attitude. We're going to explore it a lot more with Peter in just a minute. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more and go through some of these different alternative energy opportunities. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with a gentleman that knows a ton about what's going on in the Alberta energy sector. His company is called ARC, Energy Research Institute, and his name is Peter Tertzakian. Is that correct? You're the Deputy Director of ARC Energy Research Institute and the founder of, I love this, Energy File. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Energy File. So someone that loves energy. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, Energy File, PHILE, is aficionado of energy. I'm a big student of history, energy history. And, 25 years ago, I started looking and collecting objects from the past that were related to energy, old antique light bulbs, lamps, you name it, and articles, and found that there was a lot to learn from some of the past energy transitions, and started using that material in my work. I wrote a couple books. Now I've written 3 books. And if you go to energyfile.org, you'll be able to see my personal museum and collection of these artifacts, which I use in my presentations as a way of highlighting to people that this is a movie we've seen before, that while there is a lot of anxiety out there in terms of having to change the way we live, work, play, and the energy systems that support that this sort of thing is not new, and that business and society has adapted to these sorts of things. Not saying it's easy, but there is a roadmap to being able to do it.
And what was the last? Was it from something to electricity, coal to electricity?
The last big energy transition would have been post-oil price shocks of the 1970s. It would have been largely late 70s into the 80s with the shift from oil and coal-fired power plants to nuclear power. There was a substantial shift in the way we were supplied our energy in many countries around the world, of varying degree depending upon the countries. There was also a lot of efficiency policies and other types of policies put into place in the late 70s, early 80s that endured. And then there was sort of a calm period where things didn't change a lot. And now all of a sudden, starting around 10 years ago, it started to change, accelerating. Certainly in the last 2-3 years, it's been really dramatic.
With alternative energy.
Yeah, yeah,
So
renewables, solar, wind in particular.
I think it was early 2000. I read a book, I think that was called The Hydrogen Future.
Yeah, Jeremy Rifkin, I think it was at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think of that? Is hydrogen an opportunity that you're interested in at all?
I think hydrogen is a big opportunity. And guess what? We have that too. I mean, hydrocarbons, carbon, we talk about a lot. Hydro is hydrogen. And so we have a lot of hydrogen still in our oil fields, in our natural gas fields. So being able to pull it out of the ground without carbon emissions is a big focus. Being able to generate or separate hydrogen from water, H2O, using means such as solar or other renewable energy is also a big push right now. And being able to do things initially anyway, blending in it with our natural gas stream to reduce carbon intensities in our stoves if you use a gas stove or gas furnace. These are all part of the sort of the multi-decade type of changes that we're going to see. So
it sound like you're most interested in solar and wind. The criticisms of solar is the sun doesn't always shine and the wind is the wind doesn't always blow. We were going to talk a little bit about Texas. We may or may not want to, but one of the criticisms that even the governor, I think, of Texas had at the time of the big issue, when was that? About a year ago, was that a lot of the wind turbines that they were reliant on froze up and didn't work. So tell me, how can we count on solar and wind?
Well, we can't. I like solar and wind from the standpoint that it is a demonstration of how technology can reduce costs over a very short period of time in the span of a decade. I mean, solar and wind costs, especially solar, have fallen dramatically. But, I like, in a similar vein, what's happened to LED light bulbs, which are 6 times as efficient compared to a decade ago. We've got batteries, which have dramatically come down in cost, and the mating of energy storage with solar and wind is an up-and-coming technology set that I think is going to be disruptive, already is in some instances. So, this is the thing, is we're in a period where everything is quite fluid. There's all sorts of solutions out there. There isn't going to be any one solution that is going to lead us to the utopia of having clean, secure, affordable energy all at once, right? There's going to have to be a multitude of solution sets in terms of how we get it and how we use our energy and put it to work for the benefit of society.
I interviewed Vice President, one of the top people in Canada for General Motors, and he said that General Motors had an objective, I think he said by 2030, to be 100% electric. And then I met and interviewed a gentleman that was head of all the alternative energy for Total. And he said that the Total, that I understand is an oil and gas company and has been for quite a long time, was going to become completely alternative energy within the next 25 years. Are those platitudes, or do you think those things are really going to happen?
I think by 2030, you're going to see definitely a dominant fraction of vehicles sold by the automakers being electric. What that fraction is open to debate. I would think 60-70% is very possible. But how will people buy them and use them? Yeah, I'm going to give you the analogy of stoves. The stove, the big stove in your range. Then came microwave ovens. That's an alternative, right? Did you throw your stove out? No. We've got a situation where people will have probably electric vehicles and gasoline-powered vehicles for quite some time going into the future. Will the blend of that eventually change and there'll be a shift? I believe so. So by 2030, the technology is going to be fairly established in things like vehicles, where we're going to see big changes. Now, does that mean that we're going to solve our emissions problems rapidly? The answer to that is no, because merely selling electric vehicles is only one half of the thing. It's taking the combustion vehicles out of the fleet. right? That's the other half of the problem, because once you build a vehicle, it has a tendency to linger, much like an old stove in the wall.
But it's also how do you produce the electricity? And are you producing the electricity in a manner that does not create more carbon emissions, right?
Absolutely. I mean, everything has to happen synchronously for us to achieve the types of goals that we want to achieve. And there's a lot of things that have to happen in concert.
So I'm not sure about Calgary, but I saw this one prediction of Toronto, and it was number one with Go Transit, wanting to convert from diesel to electric, and their plans over the course of the next decade to convert to electric. And then number two, what people were projecting for electric cars and charging stations, they said that we'd have to triple our electric generating capacity. Does that make any sense?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's try and push a car.
In Ontario, we've been, as you've pointed out, become increasingly reliant on nuclear, but we're not building any more nuclear. Yeah. How do you triple your electrical generating capacity, particularly if you're going to do it in a hopefully more clean or completely clean manner?
Yeah, it's challenging. Or you have to be more efficient in the way that you use the electrical capacity that's generating the electricity that you're using, and be more strategic about in terms of how you use it and balance your use by charging at 2 a.m. instead of 5 o'clock in the afternoon when you come home from work, where you flip the dryer and the oven on at the same time. Like, there's a sort of load balancing, and that's where the whole discipline of smart grids and what they call electrical load or consumption balancing comes in. So, there's a lot. I'm not debating the amount of electricity that is needed to drive an expanded fleet of electric vehicles. I mean, electric vehicles, a vehicle is heavy. Try pushing one, right? Especially try pushing it uphill. It gives you a sense of how much energy it takes. So you need a pretty strong battery to be able to do that. And the electricity has to come from somewhere.
So what's the solution? Is it massive amounts of solar? Is it massive amounts of wind? Is it?
Well, I'm a believer it's all of the above. I mean, we need nuclear. It's a small modular reactors. The new next generation of nuclear capability, I think, is going to be required for the base load. I think existing power plants that are based off, say, natural gas, likely going to have carbon capture if we want to reduce the emissions off of that and maintain a base load until things are built out. I think rooftop solar has a lot of potential, not just building out in the arable land. And yeah, so it's all of the above. I'm not sitting here representing that any of this is easy. I said we've got a massive scale problem. We're talking about repiping, rewiring, rejigging the entire energy economy. And it's a big job.
Now, you talked about the last sort of energy conversion being oil price shocks in the 70s. We didn't have to go through this kind of a change at that time. When was the last time we had to actually change everything?
The last time we changed everything was probably the move from, or near everything, was from wood to coal back in the 1700s. And then there was another episode from coal to oil, but that wasn't a full shift. And we still buy wood and we still buy coal. So yes, if you're asking me, are these transitions difficult? Absolutely they are. Do they take a long time? Yes, they do. Can we accelerate it if we are clever and mindful? Yes. Is it going to be cheap? No. Is it going to take a lot of buy-in from the public and corporate Canada? Absolutely.
So how do we go about doing this? Just step by step? We need a big strategic vision.
Yeah, I mean, step by step, thinking it through. We have to have mindful policies that encourage investment, because the big issue is who's going to pay for it all. And we're not talking about billions. We're probably talking trillions here, certainly at a global scale, but even in a Canadian scale. Bearing in mind that we have spent the last 120 years building up a certain paradigm of the way our energy systems are distributed, and it's different in every single province based on circumstance. So yeah, it's going to take a lot of holistic thinking and coordination to do it properly.
I interviewed someone responsible for city planning relative to autonomous vehicles in Toronto. And it may not be a perfect analogy, but this gentleman was saying, think about the conversion of horses to cars. And that was the green solution at the time, because horses were leaving little remains behind on the road. And we switched to cars, which was the green solution. But it changed our landscape because we went from coach houses that were detached from homes to garages that were attached to homes, and dramatically changed our cityscape. The whole road system changed because we could travel at a far higher speed, and that created highways and suburbs and exurbs, et cetera. And gas stations and everything else associated with the cars. And this gentleman was saying, think about it. If we go electric and autonomous, then our whole urban fabric will change. We won't need garages. We won't need parking lots. We will have big drop-off areas. We're going to have, power stations all over the place. What do you think of that?
Well, again, there's broached a number of subjects here. Let's tackle a couple of them. I'm a little bit skeptical of the whole autonomous thing. I mean, we can't even synchronize our traffic lights. I think there's going to be some autonomous. I think it works well on freeways and highways. Within cities, yes, there's experimentation going on, but I think there's a lot to overcome to do it, to do that. And it does beg, I don't think this debate is settled between, say, public transport versus autonomous fleets. I mean, if you buy into that, then why are we building public transit, right? If everybody's going to be picked up by a self-driven electric vehicle, then if that's the future you're portraying, what do we need trains and such for anymore, right? So, I think
every laneway of a highway effectively becomes a train.
Exactly. And the technology is there to, space the cars out back to back as if it was a train. You can do that today. So, but we don't have it today because there's a whole bunch of other things that are standing in the way, including regulations and safety, blah, blah, blah. Going back to the horses versus cars, to me, that analogy as it applies to electric cars versus combustion cars is not applicable. The Model T was a compellingly better alternative to horses. Everything from speed to horsepower to range, and even it was cost parity.
And electric is not compelling.
Well, electric, I've driven one for 5 years. I think it's a superior vehicle, no question. Absolutely no question. It's a superior drive, satisfying. However, the contrast in utility, I'll call it, between an electric vehicle and a combustion engine vehicle of this, two sedans, a Model 3 Tesla, and say equivalent combustion sedan, the contrast is nowhere near what horse and buggy versus Model T is. So this was what leads me to my earlier comment that you're likely to see adoption of electric vehicles, much as, so I like to use the example again of microwave ovens. Like you're going to kind of have one of each for a while until it's really compellingly better, because electric vehicles are not cheaper than combustion vehicles yet. And given that we have inflation, which is, I think, one of the things on your list you're talking about in terms of, for example, battery materials and things. In the last month, Tesla's already increased the price of its vehicles, citing supply chain, which is really code for, hey, the batteries are costing a lot more because constituent materials are costing more. So, there's a lot of variables here and a lot of things that we have to consider as we go forward with this. There's no question things are changing. I believe Alberta, Canada, as a whole is very well situated to be able, because of our abundance of resources, our infrastructure, our highly skilled people, and so on. But there's a lot of challenges to achieving what we want to achieve.
We're chatting with Peter. Peter, I forget. How do I pronounce your last name? I apologize. Tertzakian. Peter Tertzakian, who is an energy expert based in Alberta, based in Calgary. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Peter Tertzakian in just a minute. And I'm going to ask him about ammonia, about hydrogen, about batteries, about wind, about solar. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight about energy and alternative energy primarily, but with an expert from the energy field, Peter Tertzakian, who is head of an organization called ARC in Alberta, and runs an interesting website that's all about his love and affinity for energy called Energy File. And what's that website?
It's energyfile.org. energyphile.org.
And on it, you've got a whole bunch of artifacts about energy and podcasts. And
yeah, it's on my own. It's my personal museum, if you will, but it's more than a museum. I like to think of it as a part of a library. There's the books I've written and the stories, as well as all sorts of lessons that people can take away from the past and hopefully apply to the present and the future in terms of how we think about our energy future. Tell
us about your, you said three books?
Yeah.
What are the names?
First book was 1,000 barrels a session. First book was 1,000 barrels a second, which was the rate of consumption of oil, published in 2006. And that was really a story about how the whole oil paradigm has to change, which was really quite prophetic at the time, bearing in mind it was 2006. I followed that up by saying the way we consume energy has to change. That was 2009, a book called The End of Energy Obesity. In other words, that we have a lot of weight to lose in terms of the inefficiencies of the way we consume energy. And then the latest book is really a collection of my short stories, which are meant to be entertaining and short and easy to read. 10 short stories. It's in a collection called The Investor Visit, which you can find on Amazon or on my energyfile.org website.
Awesome. Congratulations for that. That sounds interesting.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about some of these issues in terms of climate change. Climate change has been an issue. I think your premier has been against carbon taxes historically, and we got the sort of the impression in Eastern Canada that he may in fact be a climate change denier almost. My sister used to be the Assistant Deputy Minister of Energy in Ottawa, or the Environment actually, and she said that this bringing the increase in temperature down to 2 degrees Celsius wasn't enough. We had to get to 0, and really believed that some of the projections for the negative impact to our climate and to our economy, that some of the most strident climate scientists were right, and she really got me scared about the future. What do you think? What do you think about that?
Well, I think pumping anything into the atmosphere that's not natural is not a good thing. So there's all sorts of modeling and thousands of scientists working on it. I think we have to pay heed to it. I do. And I believe that reducing emissions as quickly as possible is the imperative. And that is key. We need to be thinking about how to reduce emissions as fast as possible.
What do you say to people like your premier that is either a climate change denier or maybe is a climate change denier?
Well, I'll come to that, but I think a piece of an important thing to think about is that the imperative, as I said, is to reduce emissions. The imperative is not necessarily to put industries out of business. So there's more than a subtle distinction between reducing emissions as fast as possible and trying to put an entire industry out of business. I would offer to you the latter is much harder to do. And the more people talk about putting the oil and gas industry out of business, the more people's backs get up who are employed or have vested interests in that business. So it's not a good strategy on many dimensions to say, let's put this business out of business, because you just create resistance. If you say the imperative, which is the imperative, to reduce emissions as fast as possible is the goal, then I believe the oil industry and other industries, including steel and fertilizers and other emissions cement and so on and so forth, aviation, then they'll play along, right? So I think you have to understand, I'm not going to speak for the premier, but I can tell you I understand where the sentiments come from, because you have tens of thousands of workers who are employed in this province that he represents in constituencies that over the past 10 years wake up in the morning and read headlines about how they are evil and they're destroying the planet and they need to be put out of business and so on and so forth. It doesn't feel very good. And so what do you think the reaction is going to be? It's not going to be one of, yeah, I agree, I'm evil, and I should be put out of business. It's just human resistance. And this is unfortunately problematic because it's created a lot of negative sentiment, and it affects the whole country because investors from outside this country hear and see this kind of thing going on. So why would I invest money in Canada if everybody's yelling and screaming at each other? So let's get back to sticking to the objective, which is to reduce emissions. And that is something that the industry knows how to do very well, has actually really turned the corner in terms of being solutions oriented. 70% of the oil sands segment of the oil and gas industry has already committed to net zero. I don't know of any other industry in Canada where 70% of the participants have agreed to it. Do you?
I don't.
So, let's, I think that there's a lot of sort of human psychology and nature associated with the sentiments that the premier represents. And we have to be sensitive to that. And as we think about going net zero going forward, I would argue too, based on our prior conversation here, the obstacles to achieving rapid decarbonization are not technological. There's
Really?
a lot of focus on tech. It's all social. It's all how you treat people. It's all how you create collaboration and consensus and how we work together as a team. Because if we don't get that, we're not getting there.
Well, that's interesting. Let me explain that. So you say it's not technological. We've got the technological solutions to going to net zero?
Sure.
It's social. Explain that.
Well, it's social all the way from convincing somebody to make their next appliance or vehicle purchase one that is lower emissions. It's being mindful about how you do things as simple as turning the lights out, frankly. That's social. And then social from a corporate perspective, because at the end of the day, people run corporations. So, it boils down to individual psychology of how you collaborate such that corporations and institutions and government all collaborate together to achieve a common goal. But if you're shifting the goalposts and saying, no, the objective is to put industries out of business, put people out of work, and don't worry, we'll find a job for that 50-year-old. He can become a software developer or something like that. This sort of arrogance leads us to a lot of resistance.
Right.
So, there's a lot of work to be done. Honestly, Brian, there's a lot of work to be done on stuff that has real meaningful impact.
Now, what are the ways that government and economists think of shifting that social attitude is through the price mechanism of a carbon tax. You're an economist. What do you think of carbon taxes?
I think if you want to get rid of carbon, you got to make it a commodity and put a price on it. So I have no problem with a carbon tax. I think that it has to be, though, understood how it affects, again, the psychology of people. If the carbon tax is interpreted as a punitive mechanism that affects their wallet and they don't understand it, then they're going to be resistant to it.
Oil prices have come down dramatically over the course of the last couple of years and now starting to maybe go back up. What caused the big decline such that, I think the word was at one point in time, oil was actually selling at a negative amount. And what's causing the increase today, and where do you think it's going to go?
Yeah, we traded negative for a day or two. The day, I think it was it April as a consequence of the pandemic, but it hung around $20 for quite a while. And now it's marched all the way up. There's a number of reasons for that. There's reasons that relate to divestment and directives in the free market Western world oil companies, where they are, you mentioned them, whether it's Total, many of the multinationals, BP, others are now talking about basically not growing their production. Investors are basically giving that directive: make money, don't grow your production, and start thinking about what you're going to do in the future. And that's fine, up to a certain point.
So restrict supply means that prices go up.
So if your supply, price goes up. But one has to realize that only 20% of the world's oil is in free market hands, dominantly in the United States and Canada. Right. So if you restrict supply in the United States and Canada, our friends on the other side of the world, who are not really friends, basically rub their hands and say, fine, I'll supply you with the oil. And so we have the Russians and others who are basically in a very, advantageous situation right now, because they're going to pick up the market share if we don't stop consuming. Right. So again, the focus over the course of the last decade has been on beating up on oil companies and trying to restrict the supply. But if demand doesn't come down, I can tell you that the countries on the other side of the world will be more than happy to take it and get more market power. The price of oil is likely to go up, but only to a certain point, because at the end of the day, the price of oil is controlled by two countries, Saudi Arabia and Russia. And if they see it going too high, to the point where people will want to switch, they'll just add a little bit more. They've wisened up to that, but they're not going to let it fall either. And the interesting thing about the last half dozen years, actually the last decade, is that both Canada and the United States figured out ways of bringing oil to the ground much cheaper to compete with them. But the divestment movement and others have basically said, no, don't do that. You guys need to flatten your production or decline your production, and say, okay, we'll do that.
One of the reasons why supply's gone up so much, I believe, is fracking. Is that not correct? And what do you think of fracking?
Well, I think fracking is nothing new. I mean, fracking was called torpedoing 150 years ago. You just used to throw dynamite down the hole and it exploded, and it's basically got the oil flowing. So people tend to think this stuff's new. It's not, right? They just make an issue out of it to a certain point. And so without passing judgment on good, bad, or indifferent, I think the bigger issue here is that we are not off oil in, I'll call it the West. We are nowhere near as off oil. And that we should not delude ourselves into thinking that we are in control of the oil markets. And increasingly, we're going to be ceding the power of the oil markets to countries on the other side of the world, which is an energy security issue, which is really a replay of a movie that we saw in the 1970s. So, stay tuned. I don't, there's so many variables right now, but if you're asking me where the bias of oil prices is, it's upward. And it's not in our control. We lost control probably about a year ago. We had control and when I say we, I say, the United States and Canada, with its ability to bring supply on just in time with fracking. We've kind of figured that over the last decade, but because we're not growing anymore, we have all sorts of restrictions. Others are going to be dictating the oil markets from here on forth.
I had the president of a company by the name of Hydrofuel on my show, and he said that the solution for the oil sands and the oil and gas business in Alberta was to convert oil and gas, bitumen, petroleum, whatever, to ammonia at source, put the carbon back in the ground, and ship in natural gas pipelines ammonia, which, number one, would take away the risk of any kind of contamination with leak, because you don't get contaminated and it doesn't contain any carbon. And then the ammonia can be burnt either in a car or in a power plant, just like natural gas would be, and you create energy. Is ammonia a potential solution?
It's a partial solution for certain applications. I don't think it's a mass market solution. It's not a mass market solution in my opinion. I mean, if you think building an oil pipeline is hard, try getting somebody to agree to have an ammonia running under their feet. I mean, it's pretty toxic stuff, and I think there would be a lot of issues with that. But I do think it has interesting applications in like heavy marine engines, big industrial facilities, and so on, where it's not in the sort of the mass market retail market.
You said solar has come down a lot.
Yeah, it's like 98%. I mean, it's just like unbelievable, 95%. I don't know, since
come down by 95%.
Yeah, I mean, the cost of manufacturing a solar panel a dozen years ago, if it was $100, today it's probably more like $5. Like it's really come down in costs.
And where's it going to go? Is it continue to go down? Is it like Moore's law?
It's not like Moore's law, but there's still improvements to be made, improvements made in the efficiencies. It's to the point now where putting solar panels on your roof actually makes quite a bit of sense. And I think you're going to see more of that.
So we're all going to be creating our own power on top of our roofs.
Some of it. I think there's still going to need the grid dependency. But increasingly, I think you're going to see more of it. And the government of Canada is encouraging that with its recent announcement with a $5,000 grant if you get the energy audit done, and potential for $40,000 interest-free loans to do it.
Now, wind has not come down anywhere like that. Is that correct?
Not as much, but it's come down pretty dramatically too, especially if you think about the energy it produces from the very large scale wind turbines, the offshore ones. Yeah, it's pretty competitive. We
had in Ontario, I can't remember the number, but it was like something like $800 or $850 million write-off of feed-in tariff subsidies that the previous Liberal government had put in place as an inducement to wind and solar that Doug Ford, our current premier, got rid of because he thought that it was wrong. Was it right to create this incentive when it was expensive and uneconomic, so that we could create this reducing profit supply curve?
Well, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, the Germans did it. A lot of European countries did it. Ontario did it. Some states in the US did it. And that was what was necessary to create the scale and ramp up the commercial viability of solar and drop the costs. There's no question that as a consequence of Ontario and all the other names that I mentioned, jurisdictions that I mentioned, allowed places like Alberta now to be able to install very much cheaper wind and solar power.
So we needed it. It was uneconomic, but it created the situation that we've got today, the positive situation.
So thanks very much. Yeah.
Peter Tertzakian, who is the Deputy Director of ARC Energy Research Institute and the founder of Energy File, has been sharing with us his thoughts about what's going to happen in the energy sector in Alberta and Canada and the world. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, second and 60. I've been having a fascinating conversation with Peter Tertzakian, who is the Deputy Director of ARC Energy Research Institute and the founder of Energy File. He's got a website called energyfile.org that's got a whole bunch of his artifacts and information and podcasts and other stuff available. He's written 3 books, and he's shared with us a lot of interesting information in regards to what's gone on with oil, with gas, with wind, with solar. Likes hydrogen, doesn't like ammonia as much as I do. So it's been an interesting conversation. He likes carbon taxes, but thinks that we shouldn't be putting businesses out of business and companies and employees out of work. And so we need to find a better way to position what we're doing in regards to carbon taxes and shifting people off of oil and gas, not to make people feel vulnerable. Which I think is what you need to ensure whenever you go through an economic transition. Peter, what do you think about our government? How have we been doing? What should we be doing? And what's the future for Canada and energy?
Well, work backwards. I mean, I think the future for Canada and energy is very bright. I'm always like to be a positive, optimistic person, but I truly am quite bullish about our situation. By the way, Brian, I mean, you didn't mention nuclear energy, which we also are leaders in. We also have the biggest uranium mines in the world in Saskatchewan. We've got agriculture, we've got forestry, like you name it. I mean, we are in such a privileged position. You layer on top of that the infrastructure that we've built up over the even the last century, the intellectual talents and worker talents that we have, skilled labor, and telecommunications. I mean, we've got it all in this country. I think sometimes we forget how privileged we really are with everything that we have. And so our government at the federal level, and in conjunction with trying to get some sense of communal, more congenial communal relationships with the provinces is just mandatory, because, you know, we just have it all. We've got to put it together. And I know I have friends from outside the country sort of look in at us and say, wow, you know, get it together. You've got everything. It can't be said for most countries in the world. You know, and you layer on top of that democracy and heightened sensitivity to social justice issues and all that sort of stuff. And boy, this is a privileged place to live. No wonder I think we were recently named #1 in the world by, was it The Economist or some agency? Let's celebrate that and take advantage of it in a positive way. And I think we can be leaders in the world of energy and beyond. So, you know, am I optimistic? Will we get through it? I am actually. But I hope we can do it faster.
Peter Tertzakian, Deputy Director of Arc Energy Research Institute and the founder of Energy File. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and giving us a review of what's happening in the energy sector, but also a very positive viewpoint on Canada and all the natural resources we have and all the social resources we have. And then we've got to do a better job working together to take advantage of all and build a better future for us all.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. Pleasure to be with you.
That's my show for tonight. Thanks for joining us. I come to you every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM, or you can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and video casts are available on my website, briancrombie.com, on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, on Audible, on Speakeasy, wherever you get your fun podcast to download. Peter Tertzakian, thanks so much for joining us. Good night, everybody.